Good afternoon, this is Brown at I Have Brown, and today we're going to be talking about Arion, Lord of Atlantis. So Arion was a title that DC had put out in the early 80s, which was a fantasy series with a bit of science fiction thrown in, but it had its genesis as a backup feature in another book called The Warlord, and it was namely in issue 55 of the Warlord series, in which Arion made his first appearance as a backup character. And from issues 55 to 62, Arion had his, I guess you could say, introductory, phase in which his world and cast of characters were introduced to the readers. And it was in March of 82 in which Arion was first introduced as the backup character in the Warlord series. And it was in November of 1982 in which Arion got his ongoing series. And so Arion was created by the writer Paul Kupperberg and the artist Jan Duursema, a female artist, by the way, which was something that was a little unique at the time at which this series came out, because as far as mainstream books go, there weren't a lot of female artists that were, say, front and center on a, mainstream friendly series. And so it was unique in that respect, because she brought a certain, she also brought a very visual, clear-cut style to the proceedings, in which, everything had a sort of flowing, organic beauty to it. And so, the story itself, I mean, it's one of those books that sort of, begged for a very rich visual feel, I guess you could say. And in Jan Duursema, definitely fit the bill, because it's like, the people, I mean, they looked, realistic, even though that the setting was fantastical, because the setting was supposed to be, kind of in the Ice Age, planet Earth, and it was about the final the final generation of Atlantis, and before it collapsed. And so there's some fantastical elements that come into play, but they kind of go hand in hand with the sort of naturalistic approach that Jan Duursema took to in creating this world. Of course, working from notes by Paul Kupperberg, and she came up with her own ideas too. But no, this was actually a pretty interesting series from what I've read of it so far. The story, it begins in which I believe it was the it was 45,000 BC. At least that's kind of the rough estimate in which the story takes place. And because of a kind of combination of magic and science, the technology that humanity has, basically allows them to do a lot more. There's space travel, there's telepathy, there's even handguns, like laser pistols and things like that, and which is not something you would expect for a story that was set, in 45,000 BC, but there you have it. Atlantis was apparently a very advanced civilization, and there was even talk of space travel, albeit, driven by magic as opposed to, say, science. But eventually there's a bit of a schism between, those, who, are using magic versus those using science, and it leans more towards science than magic. And while it allows them to do a lot more, it also leaves them open to a lot of other threats. Case in point, this Ice Age, which basically has been prophesied to not only consume the world, but also to end the Atlantean civilization. And so that's where the character of Arion comes in. The king of Atlantis, a guy named Datula, who, because of the prolonged lifespan of Atlanteans, basically he's it's in his 183rd year of his reign as ruler of Atlantis. He summons Arion, who is the Lord High Mage of Atlantis, to try and solve the problem of the advancing ice storm that's gradually covering the world. And Arion, he tends to be summoned when there's an emergency, and namely, say if there's a subhuman race that's trying to attack Atlantis, which they're kind of like troglodytes, if you will, or errant monsters that come out every now and then. And whenever it's too much for the Atlantean military to handle, that's when Arion is summoned. And he also has been known to divert enemy forces from other cities, usually through non-lethal means, but through his magic. And Arion is a bit of an arrogant individual, and he only obeys his king, because he's obligated to, not because he wants to necessarily help anyone. But basically, something happens in which he's communing with an oracle, that basically they're able to. The ruling body of Atlantis is able to divine messages from the oracle, but Arion's actually able to put those messages to use with his magic. But in doing so, this particular time, he makes contact with the spirit of Kakulha, who was his mentor, who basically taught him how to use magic and helped him to become the man that he was. But Kakulha was telling him that you need to relearn the ways in which you were taught, because you strayed so far, and you must come find me, and only then will you be able to save Atlantis. And so Arion finds out that his magic, after this happens, has been stripped from him. And so he has no choice, both for the sake of himself as well as the sake of Atlantis, but to follow the advice of his supposedly dead mentor. And so Arion sets out with two companions, Lady Chiana, who was the captain of the Royal Guard, and Wind, who is the lieutenant of the Royal Guard, and is kind of what you would call an Indian tracker, but also a very skilled warrior. But Lady Chiana, though, she is also a skilled warrior as well, and they both have different relationships with Arion. And Chiana is his sometime on-again, off-again lover, but she also, kind of keeps him in his place. She kind of cuts through the BS that he puts out with his attitude. And Wind, he was basically there when Arion came into the life of the people of Atlantis, and he's the one who found him and brought him to the city. And so basically there's kind of a friendship going back to that. But the three of them set out, and it's initially it's like a quest that you read about in a lot of other stories of the fantasy genre, in which a group of characters has to go find something like an artifact or so some sort, in order for the world to be saved. But it starts off like that, but it becomes a lot more complex because, amongst other things, they come across inhuman civilizations of monsters, and also they inadvertently free the physical embodiments of these gods. Namely, they're called the Trinity. You've got let's see, Kaon, who is basically the embodiment of chaos, Jamin, who is the goddess of order, and then you have Tinian, who is their leader, but he's kind of like the balance between the two. And basically, if either one of them physically confronts the other, it'll end up in cosmic upheaval. But the trio of Arion and Lady Qian and Wind inadvertently free these three gods to where they're able to essentially roam throughout the cosmos once more, and concoct their own schemes. And so there'll be times in which during their journey they'll be met with advantages partially brought about by Jamin, the goddess of order, and then other times they'll be met with obstacles set about by Cheon, and so basically it's like this tug of war, that these gods are involved in, and Arion and his friends are just, pawns in all this, and they can only, scrape the tip of the iceberg in terms of, how cosmic this all is. But they eventually Arion is able to make contact with his, supposedly deceased mentor, and in the process he relearns about who he really was and his true nature, and he's able to reclaim his power, although there is a limit on it now. He's not he doesn't have limitless power like he did prior to his loss, but he has to be more conservative with it and more intelligent with how he uses it, and being humble is part of the key. But he regains his power in time to come to Atlantis's, or try to come to Atlantis's aid, because unfortunately at this point in time Atlantis has been taken over by an enemy that Arion and his friends made on their journey. And this particular enemy was a evil wizard by the name of Garn Danuth, who is known in some quarters as the Mad Mage of Mu. And he not only looks intimidating because he's entirely pale skinned, but he's basically just uncaring in terms of how his evil affects people. I mean, he has basically driven out the life of his city and for his own pleasure, and then after he and Arion initially confront each other in a rather out-of-body experience, he returns back to the physical realm, only to basically turn another kingdom against Atlantis, starting a civil war between the kingdoms. And Arion, once he regains his power, he comes to and he attempts to help save Atlantis, but unfortunately, due to various events of a supernatural nature, including a demonic attack by a force of nature that requires both Arion's and Garn's powers to put down. Unfortunately, after they do that, Garn basically stabs Arion in the back and imprisons him and his comrades, and that's when Kulha, Arion's mentor, who was mortally wounded during this the whole cosmic portion of the journey, he uses the last of his ability to help free Arion, and in the process he imparts some wisdom into him, not only about his true nature, but about his family lineage, because it turns out that Kalkulha was the father of not only Arion, of Garn. We're talking like, thousands of years ago, before the events of this story. And so you've got, this, earth-shattering revelation for both characters, and in the process, Garn allows Arion to, free himself, and he uses the last of his ability to, before he breaks out of the fortress that he's imprisoned in, he says goodbye to his, mentor and father. And then once he leaves, Garn is able to try and marshal his forces against Arion. But at this point, Arion and his friends, Lady Cheyenne and Wind, as well as their king, Datula, and a couple of other companions they've met on their journey, all of them end up escaping the city of Atlantis, and basically, they begin another journey to try and find a way to defeat Garn. And so that's where the set of these stories that I'm talking about, that's where the stories line ends. And this was actually an interesting set of stories, because I've always been a sucker for fantasy stories, whether it be comic books, novels, or movies. And I really thought it was a fascinating idea of having a combination of science fiction and fantasy thrown together. And what they did with Arion, I actually thought it was kind of cool how they had the Atlantean civilization having all this technology that enabled them to, in some cases reach the stars, but it also left them open to, say, supernatural threats. And unfortunately, the wizard Garn is able to use this to his advantage, and also because there is an ancient vendetta that he's been nurturing for over thousands of years, and basically he's had all his time to plan. And so Atlantis, as powerful as it is caught entirely off guard, not to mention the fact that they're being threatened by this ice age that is engulfing the world. And so I liked how they tied some actual historical events into this, in the sense that there actually was an ice age that covered the world at one point. And but I don't think anyone for sure really knows how advanced the civilization of the real Atlantis actually was. I could be mistaken. I know there's documentaries about Atlantis. I probably need to check up on that. But as far as the purposes of this book goes, it was fantastical enough to where, it worked for a fantasy setting, but it was believable enough in terms of, how the human characters were depicted, as well as, the way the monsters, that were depicted were in this book. So it was a fantastical setting, but with some believable characters. And you bought the fact that there was this advanced technology that was present in the story, side by side with the magic of, Arion, of course. And speaking of Arion, I found his character to be rather intriguing, because he kind of made me think of the character of Doctor Strange, in terms of how he started off before he got his powers. Like, he was a very arrogant individual, but it wasn't until he lost the use of his hands, in which he went on that journey to find some measure of power, to not only heal his hands, but he ended up becoming the Sorcerer Supreme. But in the case of Arion, though, he already had power, but because of how complacent and arrogant he had become in terms of how he viewed his fellow humans, he was forced to go on a journey of redemption, not only for himself but for the sake of his kingdom. in order to, regain his powers. And in the process, he also rediscovered, the ties of loyalty and friendship that he had with Lady Cheyenne and Wind. And he remembered, why, they were as close as they all were. And he also remembered, he also learned, who he really was, and the fact that, in some ways, I mean, he was an ordinary human, albeit, who happened to be a mage over years of training. But he also, due to kind of a complicated, nature of his backstory, was a cosmic being, because it turns out that he had actually sacrificed his life thousands of years ago, and Calculha had actually, blocked this from his memory, initially when he was brought back to life, or when he came back into existence. But Arion, though, had sacrificed his life when he was younger, and was his soul, for lack of a better term, was taken into this star, and this entity that lived in the star, it was like this sentient mother like creature, basically nurtured him over the years, and eventually Arion was brought back to Earth. But it was him, but he was also more than human because of his time spent in the company of this sun creature, this female sun creature. And so, I mean, it's a complicated backstory, it really is, and it makes for some complicated family dynamics, because I mean, you got a mentor who was the father he never, or he forgot he even knew, and then you have his real mother, who was also the mother of Garn, who was, it turns out, who was a sorceress who had eventually turned evil. And then you have his sort of surrogate mother, which was this solar creature that basically manipulate its form to it could be either a tentacled star, or it could be sort of this phantasm of a female specter, that's just happens to dwarf the stars surrounding her. So a very complicated family backstory, to say at least. And once the family stuff comes to light, I mean, on some level you kind of feel a shred of pity for Garn. And I like that the fact that the writers had to where this revelation caught him off guard as well, and because he's been nurturing this vendetta for thousands of years. But then he finds out that the very guy that one of the guys that he's been trying to basically take out and take his place as far as ruler, or I guess sorcerer supreme, if you will, his family. And it's not a revelation he takes very well. And I liked how Arion just was able to go on this journey of growth, and sort of become the person that the good person that he used to be, as opposed to just the powerful mage that he already was. But also I like the characters of Lady Cheyenne and Wind, because I mean, Lady Cheyenne in some ways was stronger than the main character, at least in the ways of physical combat, as well as in the way in which she was able to connect to people. And also I like the character of Wind, because while he was a loyal friend to Arion and Cheyenne, there were times in which he's the kind of guy who will do what ultimately needs to be done if the occasion calls for something drastic, such as the case in point in which Garn had temporarily possessed Arion and was basically threatening to kill Lady Cheyenne, but before he could cast a spell, Wind slashes Arion, knowing that it's Garn who's possessing him, but he damages Arion's body just badly enough to where, I mean, they weren't able to show everything because I'm guessing because it was a comic code approved book, but you get the idea that Arion's nearly disemboweled, and basically what Wind was saying was, hey, if you're going to use my friend to kill her and then try and take over the world, I'm not letting you do that. I'm not letting my friend be a party to this. And so basically he was willing to kill Arion to defeat a bigger evil. And they were able to, once Garn vacated Arion's body, Wind and Cheyenne were able to get Arion some help. But the fact that Wind was willing and able to do that, that in some ways spoke volumes of how much he valued his friendship with Arion, in the sense that he obviously didn't want to hurt him in that way, but at the same time he wasn't willing to let this evil take over Arion and use Arion's own powers to destroy everything. So I also liked how Wind, you get the idea that Wind was basically a Native American, but from thousands of years ago. But there's a lot of characteristics that come into play in terms of his ability to as a natural tracker amongst other things, and so I thought that was intriguing. And the same thing with Lady Cheyenne, and there's a lot of Asian sensibilities with her character, and so it's they blend Native American and Asian sensibilities into these characters, into the whole culture of Atlantis in general. And so you get some fascinating characters in a fascinating story. And while the dialogue can be dense at times, and I don't mean that in a bad way, I just mean that there's a lot of dialogue. If you're willing to take the time and read it, you get this really intriguing story of I guess epic adventure, as well as cosmic horror, and then you also have heroic rediscovery too. And so for the sake of the introductory arc of Arion, I really enjoyed it. I'm definitely looking forward to reading the rest of the series. And another thing I liked about the Arion series is that it wasn't until much later on, we're talking much later after the original series ended, that Arion was basically brought into the mainstream DC universe, or at least having ties to the mainstream DC universe. But when Arion was when the original series was taking place, or at least was being put out by DC, it was its own thing. Yes, it was a DC Comics book, but it had it was its own world. Batman wasn't swinging in to randomly save the day, somehow 45,000 years ago, that kind of or anything like that. It was its own story, its own culture, and basically the characters all existed independent of the DC universe in general, it seemed like. But it wasn't until say later on that other characters were interacting with Arion. I remember that in Crisis on Infinite Earths, Arion is introduced as initially a rather important character in that storyline. That was actually my first time reading anything with him in it, and I was very intrigued by his character. But that was a case where all these other characters from different realities and timelines were kind of all forced together. And so in that case Arion interacting with other characters like say Blue Beetle or Gorilla Grodd, or other characters were, that at least made sense. Whereas in this case though, it was its own story, and I really appreciated that in the case of the original series. So yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to reading the rest of it. And yeah, I do like how, once you get through, say like, the, I guess you could say that the journey, the part of the journey where Arion regains his powers, I do like how the flow it seems to be a lot more natural, because it's like they had to compress a lot of exposition into a good amount of the stories that I'm reviewing here. But once the exposition was done, things flowed at a slightly faster rate, and when you get that revelation that Kulha was the father of both Arion and Garn. I mean, stuff like that. It happened at a faster rate, and it had a bit of more of a punch to the gut type feel, if that makes sense. But yeah, I really enjoyed it. I was very intrigued by the world that was introduced in this book and the characters, and so I'm going to go ahead and give the issues in question. Were basically the backup stories from Warlord 55 through 62 and issues 1 through 5 of Arion's ongoing series. And I just remembered, issues 4 and 5 were written by a guy named Doug Moench, who was the co-creator of the character of Moon Knight, but he also did a lot of Batman work. And so his writing style, I think, came into play, at just the right point in the book, and because that's where, like in issues 4 and 5, I mean, you get that, shocking revelation, but it's not as, say, dense in terms of, exactly, how much expository dialogue is in there. I mean, there's exposition, but it's not quite as, crammed with info as, say, Kupperberg's writing is. And nothing against Kupperberg, because I mean, I think he crafted a fascinating story. It's just at times it can be difficult to make it through some of the exposition that's being fed to the reader at times. So, but I mean, overall though, I mean, both were very good writers, and they both handled the character of Arion very well. So anyway though, I'm gonna go ahead and give the material of Warlord 55 through 62 and issues 1 through 5 of Arion's ongoing series 4 out of 5 stars. It was a good introductory arc, and so just as a bonus, I'll show you all the cover art of the issues that are being reviewed here. So first off, issue 55, which featured Arion's first appearance, and you had 56 of the Warlord, and you can actually see Arion's face right there. And, it's, the backup feature advertisement. You got 57, good cover art by Mike Greel. 58, 59. Unless I'm mistaken, I think this might have been the last issue in the Warlord series that Mike Greel did the interior artwork for. Only downside on this issue is whoever had it before me wrote on it at some point, so that's kind of a bummer. But anyway though, issue 60, when the evil twins attack, so let's see, 61, and then probably my favorite cover of these issues that had Arion in them, but really good cover art by Mike Greel on 62 here. Okay, and then you get to the ongoing series. this was issue number 1 of Arion, Lord of Atlantis. And then you got issue 2. I love this cover art, by the way. And Jan Duursema, really, she was a fantastic artist. I'm sure she still is, But I love how, you just got that combination of, sort of that organic human, body look, and then you have that, sort of nightmarish quality of, this spell that he's casting with the tentacled eye. The Eye of Ra, I think he called it in the book. But this is probably my favorite cover, of the issues that I'm reviewing here. And you got issue 3, also another cool cover, and that's Lady Cheyenne, and that's Wind. So now you have, faces with the names. And then you got issue 4, the origin issue. And this is the one that was guest written by Doug Moench. And, it's really cool cosmic looking art there. And last but not least, issue 5. The cover art does a pretty good job of, showing the tragic outcome of this story with Kalkulha's death, at the hands of Garn, right there at the top. So yeah, thank you very much for taking the time to check out my review. I hope it was informative about the comic book series, and I'll definitely be reviewing, the rest of the issues in the near future. So I hope y'all enjoyed it, and y'all have a good day. Bye.